In December 2021, a small tech publication called The Information published a story that Apple never wanted you to read. It revealed that 5 years earlier, Tim Cook had flown to Beijing and personally signed a secret agreement with the Chinese government, a memorandum of understanding worth roughly $275 billion. Not a trade deal, not a joint venture, a pledge, a promise that the most valuable company in American history would keep pouring money, technology, and know-how into the one country Washington now considers its greatest strategic rival. $275 billion. To put that number in perspective, the Marshall Plan, the program that rebuilt all of Western Europe after World War II, cost about $13 billion at the time. Adjusted for inflation, Apple's 5-year commitment to China was roughly double the Marshall Plan. One company, one country, and almost nobody knew it was happening. Here's the uncomfortable question at the center of this story. Who actually holds the power in that relationship? Apple's official narrative is that it chose China for its skilled workers, its scale, its speed. But there is another reading of the evidence, laid out in painstaking detail by journalist Patrick McGee in his 2025 book, Apple in China, built on more than 200 interviews with former Apple executives and engineers. In that reading, Apple didn't just build its supply chain in China. China built its technological rise on Apple, and then quietly locked the door behind it. Today, roughly 4 out of every 5 iPhones on Earth are still assembled in the People's Republic of China. Apple has spent nearly a decade and tens of billions of dollars trying to change that ratio, moving production to India and Vietnam, pledging hundreds of billions to American manufacturing. And at nearly every step, Beijing has found a way to remind Cupertino exactly who controls the factory floor. This is the story of how the world's most admired company wired its own fate into the territory of an authoritarian state. The secret deals, the concessions, the lockdown that broke iPhone City, and the escape plan that Beijing is actively sabotaging right now. Because Apple's China problem isn't really about Apple. It's a preview of the question every Western company, every investor, and every government will have to answer this decade. What do you do when your greatest asset is also your greatest hostage? To understand how Apple ended up here, you have to go back to a company that was nearly dead. In the late 1990s, Apple was weeks from bankruptcy, and the man Steve Jobs hired to fix its operations was a quiet supply chain specialist from IBM and Compaq named Tim Cook. Cook's doctrine was simple and ruthless. Inventory is evil, factories are a liability, and manufacturing should be someone else's problem. Within years, he had shut down Apple's own plants in California, Ireland, and Singapore. The someone else turned out to be Foxconn, formerly Honhai Precision Industry, a Taiwanese contractor run by Terrigu, who was building industrial campuses in mainland China at a scale the world had never seen. Shenzhen's Longhua complex would eventually employ hundreds of thousands of workers behind a single set of gates, dormitories, canteens, its own fire brigade. When Apple needed to ramp the iPod and then the iPhone, Foxconn could summon tens of thousands of assembly workers in weeks. But here's what the standard telling gets wrong. This was never just about cheap labor. Apple sent thousands of its own engineers from California to live in Chinese factory towns, teaching suppliers processes they had never mastered. Precision anodization, computer numerical control machining at consumer scale, tolerances borrowed from the aerospace industry. Apple didn't find a great manufacturing ecosystem in China. Apple, to a remarkable degree, created it. Patrick McGee's reporting puts hard numbers on that transfer. By 2015, Apple was investing roughly $55 billion a year into its Chinese operations. Supplier machinery, training, facilities. And since 2008, Apple and its partners have trained a cumulative workforce in China, larger than the entire labor force of California. Some 28 million people have passed through its supplier ecosystem. No corporation in history had ever transferred so much industrial capability to a foreign state, let alone one governed by a communist party with explicit ambitions to absorb exactly that capability. For 15 years, the bargain looked like genius. Apple's margins soared, iPhones shipped in the hundreds of millions. Cook succeeded Jobs and became the operator king of global capitalism. The stock market's verdict was unambiguous, but a bargain has two sides. And while Cupertino counted its profits, Beijing was counting something else: leverage. And the first public demonstration of that leverage came sooner than anyone at Apple expected. Before we get to the confrontation, you need to see the machine, because its scale is the whole reason this story matters. Fly into Zhengzhou, a city of 10 million in Henan province, and on the outskirts you'll find a walled campus the size of a small city. Locals call it iPhone City. At peak production, Foxconn's Zhengzhou complex has employed around 300,000 workers, more than the entire population of Pittsburgh, most of them assembling one product line, the iPhone. During the autumn ramp for each new model, this single site has produced on the order of 500,000 iPhones per day. Workers live in dormitories stacked around the production halls, recruited by local governments that treat Foxconn hiring targets as political mandates. Henan's provincial authorities built roads, power infrastructure, and a customs zone around the plant. At times, iPhones have accounted for a striking share of the province's entire export economy. Think about what that means structurally. This is not a factory in the way a Toyota plant in Kentucky is a factory. It is a joint project between a Taiwanese contractor, an American client, and the Chinese party state, with the state supplying land, subsidies, labor recruitment, and logistics. The efficiency Western consumers experience as the iPhone just ships on time is the product of an administrative machine that only an authoritarian developmental state can run. And Zhengzhou is one node among many. Apple's supplier list spans dozens of Chinese cities: Shanghai for chips and modules, Chengdu for iPads, Shenzhen and Suzhou for components. Of Apple's top 187 suppliers in recent years, over 80% maintained production facilities in mainland China. The clustering is the point. A design tweak in California can be prototyped, tooled, and mass-produced within the same 100-kilometer radius in days. Now hold that image. 300,000 workers behind one wall, 500,000 phones a day, an ecosystem no other country on Earth can currently replicate, and ask the question Beijing asked long before Washington did. If you control the wall, don't you also control the company that depends on what happens inside it? In 2013, China's government decided to test exactly that proposition, live on state television. March 15, 2013. World Consumer Rights Day in China, when state broadcaster CCTV airs an annual primetime special naming and shaming companies that allegedly mistreat Chinese consumers. That year's chosen target was Apple. The accusation that Apple's warranty policies in China were inferior to those offered elsewhere was, by most independent assessments, thin. The campaign that followed was not. The People's Daily, the Communist Party's official newspaper, ran days of escalating attacks, one headline demanding Apple abandon its unparalleled arrogance. Inside Apple, the first instinct was to treat it like a Western PR problem. Issue a factual clarification, let it blow over. It didn't blow over. The attacks intensified with a coordination that made clear this was not journalism. It was a message from the state. A message that said, your success in this market exists at our pleasure. What happened next tells you everything about the power dynamic. On April 1st, 2013, Tim Cook, chief executive of the most valuable company in the world, published a formal letter of apology in Chinese, admitting insufficient communication and pledging to improve warranty service. State media graciously accepted. The People's Daily declared the apology sincere. The campaign switched off as abruptly as it had switched on. Consider the asymmetry that moment revealed. When the United States government wants something from Apple, as the FBI did in 2016, demanding it unlock a terrorist's iPhone, Apple publicly refuses and litigates. When Beijing merely criticized warranty policy through a television program, Apple's CEO bowed within 2 weeks. Not because Cook is weak, but because he could count. China was becoming Apple's second largest market, and 100% of its iPhone assembly sat on Chinese soil. There was no BATNA. There was no walking away. The 2013 episode was, in retrospect, a proof of concept for Beijing. It established that Apple would concede under pressure, and it calibrated how much pressure was needed. Over the following 3 years, as Xi Jinping consolidated power and tightened control over foreign technology firms, the demands would escalate from apologies to something far more consequential: money, data, and obedience, formalized in a document the public was never supposed to see. By early 2016, the pressure had become existential. In April of that year, Chinese regulators abruptly shut down Apple's iBook Store and iTunes Movies service, 6 months after launch, without meaningful explanation. App Store approvals slowed. Regulatory friction appeared in places it had never existed. Inside Apple, executives understood the pattern from 2013. This was not bureaucracy. This was negotiation. Apple's response operated on multiple levels. Publicly, in May 2016, it invested $1 billion in Didi Chuxing, China's ride-hailing champion, a gesture of goodwill that baffled analysts at the time. Privately, according to the Information's landmark 2021 investigation, later corroborated by Patrick McGee, Tim Cook and Apple executives made a series of visits to Beijing, culminating in a 5-year memorandum of understanding signed with China's National Development and Reform Commission. The terms, as reported, Apple would commit to investing more than $275 billion in China over 5 years, in supplier development, research centers, renewable energy, and technology partnerships. It would help Chinese manufacturers develop, quote, the most advanced manufacturing technologies, train Chinese talent, and increase procurement from Chinese suppliers. In exchange, the regulatory harassment would ease. Skeptics note fairly that $275 billion partly formalized spending Apple was already doing, $55 billion a year times 5. But that's precisely what makes it remarkable. Beijing converted Apple's routine business operations into a political tribute, documented and enforceable. Ask yourself what would have happened if this had been public in 2016. An American icon signing a $250 billion technology transfer commitment with a strategic rival's economic planning agency at the exact moment Washington was waking up to Chinese industrial policy. The deal stayed secret for 5 years. Apple has never disputed the core reporting. It has simply declined to discuss it. And the concessions didn't stop at money. The years after the memorandum trace a quiet ledger of compliance that most iPhone users have never itemized. Each entry taken alone was defensible. A legal requirement, a local regulation, the cost of doing business. Taken together, they sketch the outline of something else, the progressive capture of the world's most powerful company's decision-making by a foreign state. Let's read that ledger. Start with the data. In 2017, China's new cybersecurity law required foreign companies to store Chinese users' data inside China, operated by a Chinese partner. Apple complied comprehensively. iCloud data for Chinese users moved to servers run by Guizhou Cloud Big Data, a company owned by the provincial government, with the cryptographic keys stored in China as well. Apple insists it retains control of the keys and has never compromised user security. But the structural fact remains. The data of hundreds of millions of Chinese users, and the keys to it, physically reside within the jurisdiction of the state security apparatus. Then, the apps. In 2017, Apple removed hundreds of VPN applications from its Chinese App Store, the tools citizens use to tunnel under the Great Firewall. The New York Times app, removed. In 2019, during the Hong Kong protests, HKMap.live, an app demonstrators used to track police, was removed within days of criticism from the People's Daily. Research groups have documented thousands of apps unavailable in Apple's China store, from encrypted messengers to news outlets to the Dalai Lama. Then the details so small they're almost poetic. The Taiwan flag emoji does not render on iPhones sold in mainland China. Engravings of politically sensitive words are refused. In 2021, Apple agreed to a Chinese request to tighten the AirDrop file sharing feature, limiting the Everyone setting to 10 minutes. Shortly after protesters had used AirDrop to spread anti-government messages. The change shipped first in China, then worldwide. Each of these decisions has a lawyerly justification, and Apple deploys them fluently. We follow local law in every country where we operate. It's true as far as it goes, but notice the pattern this chapter and the last two have established. 2013, apologize on demand. 2016, pay on demand. 2017 onward, censor on demand. The company whose brand is built on privacy as a human right operates in its most important manufacturing country as a compliant instrument of information control. Here's the strategic insight buried in this ledger, and it's the hinge of the entire story. Every concession deepened the dependency that made the next concession unavoidable. And through it all, one assumption kept the whole structure feeling safe. The assumption that China itself was stable, rational, and open for business. In the autumn of 2022, inside the walls of iPhone City, that assumption came apart in the most literal way imaginable. October 2022. China is deep in the third year of zero COVID, a policy of total lockdowns enforced with a rigor the West struggled to comprehend. When an outbreak reached Foxconn's Zhengzhou campus, authorities and management sealed the site into closed-loop production. Workers would live, sleep, and assemble iPhones inside the wall, cut off from the city. Food ran short. Medical care was chaotic. Rumors of uncontrolled infection spread through dormitories housing some 200,000 people. Then the workers did something the system never budgeted for. They left. In late October, images spread across Chinese social media of workers climbing fences and walking dozens of kilometers along highways, luggage in hand, heading home to their villages. The world's most sophisticated supply chain, the one that could summon 500,000 phones a day, was hemorrhaging its workforce on foot. Foxconn and local governments scrambled, offering bonuses and mobilizing party cadres and even military veterans to recruit replacements. Tens of thousands of new workers arrived in November and discovered, they said, that the promised bonuses had been restructured. On November 22nd, the campus erupted. Thousands of workers clashed with riot police and hazmat-suited security in scenes of open revolt. Barricades, tear gas, workers beaten on camera. In the People's Republic of China, at the crown jewel of its export economy, iPhone assembly had produced a riot. The financial damage was immediate and quantifiable. Apple issued a rare investor warning on November 6, 2022, acknowledging that shipments of the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max would be lower than anticipated. Analyst Ming-Chi Kuo estimated a shortfall of 15 to 20 million premium iPhones for the holiday quarter. Wedbush's Daniel Ives put the bleed at roughly $1 billion a week in lost sales. When the December quarter closed, Apple reported revenue of $117.2 billion, down 5% year over year, its first quarterly decline in nearly 4 years, with iPhone revenue down about 8%. But the deeper loss wasn't measured in dollars. For 2 decades, Apple's China bet had rested on a single premise. Whatever else Beijing was, it was a reliable place to make things. Zero COVID shattered that premise, not through malice toward Apple, but through something scarier: indifference. The Chinese state had demonstrated it would sacrifice the crown jewel of its export economy for domestic political objectives without hesitation. In Cupertino, the conversation changed permanently. The question was no longer whether to reduce dependence on China. It was how fast and whether it was even possible. The escape route ran through India, and Apple had been quietly surveying it for years. Wistron began assembling the humble iPhone SE in Bengaluru back in 2017. But those early efforts were token gestures, single-digit percentages, older models, mostly for the local market. What changed after Zhengzhou was velocity and ambition. Apple began moving flagship production. Current generation iPhones, built in India within weeks of global launch, for export to the world. The numbers tell the story of an acceleration without precedent in Apple's history. In March 2025 alone, Foxconn's Indian operations shipped $1.31 billion worth of iPhones, while Tata Electronics, the Indian conglomerate that had acquired Wistron's operations and taken a stake in Pegatron's, shipped another 612 million. By 2025, India accounted for roughly 1 in 5 iPhones made globally. By early 2026, that figure reached approximately 25%, with analysts projecting as much as 35% by the end of the year, and Apple planning for the majority of US-bound iPhones to come from Indian lines. New Delhi, for its part, rolled out the red carpet with production-linked incentive schemes worth billions, expedited land approvals, and a political narrative, Make in India, for which Apple serves as the flagship proof point. Foxconn broke ground on massive new campuses in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. Tata scaled hiring at a pace that echoed Henan circa 2010. On paper, history was repeating itself, one border to the southwest. Vietnam absorbed a parallel stream. AirPods, iPads, Apple Watch assembly migrating into Vietnamese industrial parks. Apple's supplier map, once a solid red mass, began showing genuine diversification for the first time in 20 years. Wall Street cheered. Headlines declared the era of China plus one. Tim Cook characteristically said as little as possible. But notice what this escape plan actually requires to succeed. It requires China to permit it. The machines that tool iPhone production lines are largely made in China. The engineers who know how to install and calibrate them are largely Chinese. The components, displays, camera modules, batteries, rare earth magnets in every speaker and haptic engine flow overwhelmingly from Chinese factories. India assembles, China still supplies. And in Beijing, planners who had spent 2 decades absorbing Apple's knowledge understood the moment perfectly. If Apple was going to leave, it would have to do so using China's own tools. So they simply started taking the tools away. It began quietly in early 2025 with what officials called verbal guidance. No published regulation, no announcement, nothing to protest at the WTO. According to multiple reports, Beijing instructed regulatory agencies and local governments to discourage the export of manufacturing equipment and technology to India and Southeast Asia. Shipments of specialized machinery bound for Indian iPhone plants began encountering mysterious customs delays. Some never left port at all. Then came the people. In mid-2025, Foxconn instructed hundreds of Chinese engineers and technicians, the specialists who set up and optimize iPhone production lines, to return home from its Indian factories. More than 300 were recalled within weeks, reportedly under pressure from Beijing. These were precisely the people India could not yet replace, the human carriers of 2 decades of accumulated process knowledge. Foxconn scrambled for Taiwanese and American substitutes. Production ramps for the next iPhone slowed measurably. Then came the materials. In April 2025, China, which controls roughly 90% of global rare earth processing, tightened export controls on critical elements, including dysprosium, essential for the miniature high-performance magnets and acoustic components. Foxconn's AirPods facility in Telangana found itself waiting on end-user certificates that Chinese authorities simply declined to approve. Supplies stopped. The message required no translation. Your escape runs on our permission. Step back and look at the choreography. Equipment blocked. Engineers recalled. Materials withheld. None of it aimed at Apple by name. All of it aimed at the single strategic objective of ensuring that China plus one remains a slogan rather than a reality. This is what 2 decades of absorbed leverage looks like when it's finally exercised. Not a dramatic rupture, but a hand tightening, calibrated precisely below the threshold that would force an open confrontation. And here is the truly uncomfortable part for Cupertino. Beijing was fighting this battle on 2 fronts simultaneously, because while one hand squeezed Apple's exit route through India, the other was working on something arguably more damaging, taking back Apple's customers at home. The company wasn't just struggling to leave China, it was losing China itself. In August 2023, a Chinese phone launched with no launch event, no specifications published, almost no marketing, the Huawei Mate 60 Pro. Within hours, teardown specialists discovered why it mattered. Inside was the Kirin 9000S, a 7nm processor fabricated by China's SMIC, a chip American export controls were specifically designed to make impossible. Chinese state media treated it as a technological declaration of independence. Nationalist consumers treated it as a duty to buy. The timing, whether coincidental or not, was surgical, weeks before the iPhone 15 launch. That same September, reports emerged that Chinese government agencies and state-owned enterprises were instructing employees not to bring iPhones to work, restrictions that expanded steadily. Beijing never published a formal ban, preserving deniability while the chilling effects spread through the tens of millions of people employed by the state and its enterprises. The market data traced the wound. Apple's Greater China revenue declined for 6 consecutive quarters. In the final quarter of 2024, iPhone shipments in China fell 18.2% year-over-year, and Apple slid to third place in its second most important market, behind Huawei at 18.1% share and Xiaomi at 17.2%. A market Apple had led outright just a year earlier. Greater China revenue for that holiday quarter, $18.5 billion, down more than 11%. Structural factors deepened the slide. Apple Intelligence, the AI feature suite, Apple bet its upgrade cycle on, could not launch in China without a licensed local partner, leaving Chinese iPhones conspicuously less capable than Chinese flagships shipping domestic AI. Aggressive government subsidies favored domestic brands in the mid-market, and an unquantifiable but real current of consumer nationalism recast the iPhone from status symbol to statement of questionable loyalty. Absorb the full geometry of the trap as it stood by 2025. Apple could not manufacture outside China without Beijing's tolerance. It could not sell inside China without Beijing's goodwill. Both levers sat in the same hands. And at precisely this moment of maximum exposure, the other superpower, the one where Apple is headquartered, listed, and politically accountable, decided to apply its own pressure. Washington was about to squeeze the other side of the vice. In April 2025, the second Trump administration unleashed the broadest tariff regime in modern American history, and Chinese-made electronics sat squarely in the blast radius. As rates stacked up, iPhones assembled in China faced import duties reaching approximately 55% when entering the United States, while Indian-assembled devices faced around 10%. For a product with tens of millions of US unit sales a year, that spread was not a rounding error. It was a forced restructuring order with a customs form attached. Apple responded with the tool it knows best, a giant number. In February 2025, Cook announced a $500 billion 4-year U.S. investment program. Server factories in Houston, a supplier academy in Michigan, expanded chip sourcing from TSMC's Arizona fabs. By August 2025, standing beside the president, he raised it to $600 billion, complete with a gift of a custom gold and glass statuette for the Oval Office. Critics noted, as with the $275 billion figure in Beijing 9 years earlier, that much of it repackaged existing spending. The choreography, though, was the point. Apple now pays public tribute in both capitals, because that is the pattern worth naming plainly. A $275 billion pledge to Beijing in 2016, extracted in secret. A $600 billion pledge to Washington in 2025, performed on camera. Same company, same playbook, opposite directions. The world's most valuable corporation buying operating permission from two governments that are actively preparing for conflict with each other. The tariff pressure came with an additional twist. The president publicly demanded that Apple build iPhones in America, threatening a 25% penalty on Indian-made devices, attacking not just Apple's China presence, but its escape route. Never mind that supply chain analysts near universally judge a US-assembled iPhone economically fantastical within any relevant time frame. Estimates of the retail price of a fully American-made iPhone run to multiples of the current one. The demand itself became one more geopolitical tax on a company that had optimized for a world without geopolitics. So by 2026, Apple's operating environment amounts to this. Beijing restricts its exit, erodes its Chinese sales, and controls its materials. Washington taxes its products, subpoenas its attention, and demands relocation miracles. Two superpowers, one supply chain, zero good options. Which forces the question this entire story has been building toward. The one whose answer explains why Apple simply cannot do the thing everyone keeps telling it to do. Why can't Apple just leave? Start with what an iPhone actually is. Roughly 1,000 components, sourced from hundreds of suppliers, converging on an assembly line where they must be fitted together at a rate of one device every few seconds, at a quality level that tolerates microns of error in volumes exceeding 200 million units a year. Assembly, the part India is learning, represents the visible tip. The mass below the waterline is components, tooling, and process engineering. And that mass remains overwhelmingly Chinese. Consider tooling, the least glamorous and most decisive layer. Every new iPhone requires thousands of custom machine tools, jigs, molds, cutting equipment, designed and fabricated in weeks between final design and mass production. The ecosystem that can do this at Apple's speed exists in one place: the industrial clusters of coastal China, built substantially with Apple's own money and training over 2 decades. McGee's book documents Apple veterans making exactly this point. The constraint was never wages, it was concentrated capability. Then consider what economists call the agglomeration effect. In Shenzhen or Suzhou, a component shortage can be resolved with a phone call and a truck. An engineering problem at a supplier can be swarmed by specialists who arrive within hours, not visas. India in 2026 is where China was around 2007. Impressive trajectory, but the surrounding forest of sub-suppliers, materials processors, and equipment makers takes a decade or more to grow, even without an adversary actively pruning it. And as we've seen, the adversary is pruning. There's also a quieter reason, the one Apple prefers not to discuss. China remains its second largest market, worth on the order of $60 to $70 billion a year, even in decline. A genuine rupture, the kind that would follow an aggressive public decoupling, puts that revenue at risk immediately. Every incentive points toward the same corporate posture: diversify quietly, deny loudly, and above all, never provoke. Which is why you will never hear Tim Cook say a critical word about the Chinese government. He can't afford to. Cook himself said it plainly years ago: there is no supply chain in the world more critical to Apple than China's. This is what capture means. Not a dramatic seizure, but a configuration of incentives in which the rational move at every individual decision point is deeper compliance. Patrick McGee's darkest observation is that Apple's predicament is not an accident that befell the company. It is the compounding return on choices Apple made freely, brilliantly, and profitably for 20 years. The trap was built with the prisoner's own engineering excellence. And that raises the final, uncomfortable set of questions. The ones about what happens if the two superpowers stop competing and start colliding. Let's be disciplined here, because this is where analysis usually dissolves into fear. These are conditionals, not predictions, but they are conditionals that Apple's own board, the Pentagon, and every serious investor now wargames explicitly. Condition 1. What happens if tensions over Taiwan escalate into blockade or conflict? The iPhone dies twice in that scenario. Its assembly sits in mainland China, and its brain, the A-series and M-series processors, is fabricated almost entirely by TSMC in Taiwan. No corporate contingency plan survives that contact. Estimates of the global economic damage from a Taiwan conflict run into the trillions. Apple would be among the largest single casualties. Condition 2, less apocalyptic and more plausible. What happens if Beijing decides to make an example? Not war, just the Apple treatment, escalated. A cybersecurity investigation like the one that hobbled Micron's China sales in 2023. A formal government procurement ban. A finding that some Apple practice violates data law, with iCloud operations suspended pending review. Each tool has been tested on other companies. Each is reversible, deniable, and devastating. And each becomes more likely every time US-China relations lurch downward over chips, tariffs, or Taiwan. Condition 3. What happens if the escape simply takes too long? Suppose India reaches 35, even 50% of assembly by the late 2020s. The components underneath still flow from China. A rare earth embargo, a battery export licensing regime, a quality inspection slowdown at Shenzhen customs. Any of these reaches into Indian factories within weeks. Diversifying final assembly without diversifying the component base is moving the front door while leaving the foundations in place. Apple knows this. It is qualifying suppliers in a dozen countries. The timeline is measured in decades. The political risk is measured in news cycles. And there's a fourth conditional almost nobody prices in. What happens if China stops needing Apple? For 20 years, Beijing's restraint had a simple logic. Apple employed millions, anchored exports, and taught Chinese industry. But the students have graduated. Huawei is resurgent, Xiaomi thrives, BYD, also an Apple assembler, now symbolizes Chinese manufacturing prowess in its own right. Every quarter, the cost to Beijing of squeezing Apple falls. The hostage's ransom value is depreciating. None of these scenarios is destiny. Apple has navigated existential threats before, and betting against its operational competence has impoverished a generation of skeptics. But notice what all four conditionals share. In every one, the decisive variable is a political decision made in Beijing or Washington, not a product decision made in Cupertino. The world's most valuable company has become, on the dimension that matters most, a price taker. Which brings us finally to the reckoning, what this story actually means and what it tells us about the world being built right now. Weigh the ledger honestly, because honesty cuts both ways. The China bet made Apple the most valuable company on Earth. A market capitalization measured in trillions, products of a quality and price that no other arrangement on the planet could have delivered, and along the way, hundreds of millions of people lifted through industrial employment. If Tim Cook's defenders say the strategy was not a mistake, but the single most successful operational decision in business history, the numbers are on their side. But the same ledger records what was traded away: editorial control over the App Store in its largest manufacturing base, user data housed within reach of a state security apparatus, a CEO's public silence on every abuse, Xinjiang, Hong Kong censorship, maintained with a discipline that would be called cowardice in a smaller company, and is called fiduciary duty in this one. And beneath it all, the great transfer. 28 million workers trained, tens of billions a year invested, an industrial education that Chinese planners openly credit with accelerating their nation's rise up the value chain. Apple set out to use China and taught China everything it knew. The judgment of Patrick McGee's sources, Apple veterans, not activists, is that Cupertino woke up to the geometry of this bargain roughly a decade after Beijing did. There's a broader mirror here, and it's worth looking into. Apple is simply the largest and purest specimen of a species, the Western corporation that treated globalization as permanent, efficiency as the only variable worth optimizing, and politics as a solved problem. Volkswagen in Xinjiang, Tesla in Shanghai, half the pharmaceutical precursor supply in Chinese factories. The pattern repeats at every scale. Apple's China problem is the West's China problem, expressed in the world's most legible balance sheet. If you've followed this story to here, you're exactly who this channel is built for. We trace money and power through the systems that actually run the world, one investigation at a time. If this one earned it, subscribe, share it with someone who still thinks the iPhone is just a phone, and tell us in the comments which supply chain, company, or quiet deal you want opened up next. The archive of stories like this is deeper than most people suspect. Because here's the thing about dependency. It is symmetrical right up until the moment it isn't. For 2 decades, Apple and China genuinely needed each other, and the relationship produced the most successful product in the history of commerce. But needs decay at different rates. And as we close, it's worth asking the question that hangs over every scenario we've examined. The question that transforms this from a business story into something closer to a geopolitical thriller with a trillion-dollar protagonist. When the music stops, who is holding whom? Picture Tim Cook's position in 2026, stripped of the keynote polish. On one side, a president demanding impossible factories and rewarding tribute with tariff exemptions. On the other, a Politburo that holds his production lines, his second largest market, and, in a filing cabinet in Beijing, the receipts of a $275 billion promise. Above him, a 5-year clock. India needs time. Component diversification needs decades, and every escalation between the superpowers shortens the runway. He is 65 years old, walking a tightrope that has no far platform. The walk itself is the job. And the strangest part? By the standards of what he controls, Cook is playing the hand close to perfectly. The pledges to both capitals, the silence on politics, the glacial diversification, the refusal to be provoked. Every move is individually rational. That's the genuinely unsettling lesson of this story. Apple's predicament was not produced by stupidity, and it will not be solved by brilliance. It was produced by a world that changed its rules after the bet was placed. Structure beats strategy. The numbers to remember as this story keeps unfolding in earnings calls and export data: 275 billion promised to Beijing, 600 billion promised to Washington, 28 million workers trained, 55 billion a year invested at the peak, $1 billion a week lost when a single campus stumbled, 25% of production relocated after a decade of effort, and 75% still inside the wall. Whatever headline you read about Apple next, run it against those numbers. They are the real story. The deeper current here will outlive Apple's chapter of it. The 40-year experiment of separating economics from politics, of assuming supply chains were beneath geopolitics, is over. What replaces it is being negotiated right now in customs delays at Shenzhen, in engineer recalls from Chennai, in tariff schedules and rare earth licenses, and the negotiators are states, not CEOs. Every company on Earth is downstream of that negotiation. Most just don't know it yet. Apple knows it better than anyone alive. So the next time you pick up an iPhone, this object of impossible smoothness, designed in California, that arrives as if from nowhere, hold it for 1 extra second. You are holding the physical output of the most consequential corporate bargain of the modern era: American genius, Chinese state power, and a dependency neither side can safely unwind. Somewhere in Zhengzhou, a shift is starting. Somewhere in Chennai, a line is being calibrated. And somewhere between Washington and Beijing, the question this whole story asks is still open. Not whether the world's greatest company can escape, but whether it was ever really free. Thanks for watching.